Ambassador Young, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fair to middling for an old
Yeah,
man.
yeah. How's Carolyn and the family?
Everybody's doing well.
Oh, that's good.
In
You've
fact,
been doing
we were very lucky. We made it through the Corona season without, I don't think we had anybody getting sick,
okay. Okay. Well, let's
but
hope
we
for
all got our shots immediately. As soon as they were available, um, we went right straight to Morehouse Medical School and got vaccinated.
In
And
fact, I
then
remember.
my second shot, and then as soon as the booster shots were available, I got that.
Yep, yeah. I've gotten the three shots. In fact, as I recall, last January or early February, you got your first shot with the late Hank Aaron over
Yeah,
at Morehouse, correct?
that's right.
Okay, okay. Well, thanks, Ambassador, for your time. I appreciate you. As I told you, I manage a bi-monthly online newsletter called Our House DC for the Washington Informer here in the DC area. And
Hmm.
in that, twice a month, Ambassador, we examine the challenges of Black homeownership, particularly here in DC and Ward 7 and 8, but also nationally. So I know that a part of Dr. King and your movement in the 60s focused on Chicago and highlighting poor housing conditions in Chicago. But before we get there, I had a couple of early questions. So you, Ambassador, were born and grew up in New Orleans. How did you envision your life's journey when you were a young man, when you were a kid?
I don't think I did envision it. I've always had a good life, I felt. Um, but my life was always filled with challenges. I think I grew up in a neighborhood that required that I be an ambassador because there was an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another. The Nazi party headquarters was on the third corner, and a Chevrolet dealership around the fourth corner. And in the Nazi party headquarters, they were Highland Hitler. And my father helped me a great deal by saying that these are white supremacists, and white supremacy is a sickness. And you don't get angry and upset with sick people, and you don't let them bother you in what you think of yourself. And he actually took me to the movies to see Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics. I was 4 years old. And he said, now, when Jesse Owens won the 100 meters, Hitler refused to give him his medal. He marched his stormtroopers out of the stadium as an insult to Jesse. But Jesse didn't pay any attention to it because he was there to win gold medals.
It inspired
And
him further.
he just focused on what he had to do and won 3 more gold medals, including breaking some world records. So my father's lesson was, you don't get distracted by other people's sickness, and you focus on what you have to do, and you do it as well as you can. And he would say, don't get mad, get smart. If you get upset, it blocks your brain and creates confusion. But if you stay calm, your mind is more powerful than your fist or your feet. But he said, now you have to know how to fight. But if you know how to fight, you don't have to fight. Or at least you don't have to fight but once. And so I, well, I have followed that. And I think jumping to 1966 in Chicago, when Dr. King moved there, it was because
Well, Ambassador, if I may interrupt you,
yeah,
what was the background to the decision of you all to go to Chicago as opposed to any other northern city? Why Chicago?
well, one, we were invited, and we were invited by an organization, the Community Council of Community Organizations, CCCO, a coordinating council of community organizations. And they were pretty well organized. There were conversations around the country that were criticizing Dr. King and saying that we were concentrating in the South because nonviolence would not work in the North. And I think that sort of presented a challenge. So we moved into the west side of Chicago. The only problem was it was winter. And one of the first weekends I was there, it dropped down to 13 degrees below zero. And there was no heat in the apartment I was in. And it was on 16th and Hamlin. Mm-hmm. And there was a three-story walk up. And I had every piece of clothing I owned on. And you know, couldn't get warm enough. Yeah, but he came back that Sunday after church, and some people had heard he was there, and they came over and invited him and asked him to come see their apartments. And what we found was that there was they didn't have any heat either. I remember there was a couple of babies, little children, that there was no heat. They had them wrapped in newspaper. And so we immediately took all the money we had and called for delivery of coal. And we fired the furnaces. When the word got out that Dr. King was in town, everybody came. And so we started a rent strike. And when you pay your rent, you're expecting some service. And we couldn't get any service. They were not getting any service. So we took the rent. And we filed a suit against them, against the landlords. And of course, they didn't want the trouble of the suit. So we never, I don't know where it happened, what happened in the courts, but we by and large asked people to pay their rent to us, and we bought the coal and we started fixing up their apartments. Now, we really got cooperation from Mayor Daley and President Johnson, because we got some help from Washington, we had a rent strike in which we got from HUD. We started repairing the apartments, and we hired contractors then to just move in and straighten up a whole block of housing. And we were able to put in, fix the furnaces so they were running. They renovated the kitchens. And basically they started little by little, totally renovating the houses. As they got it, and as we got empty apartments fixed up, we moved the people from one apartment to another, and then fixed those. So the rent strike turned out to be very successful, because the lawsuits held up the landlords in court. But most of these were most of these slums were what were white folks' generational wealth. They had inherited them, but they weren't really interested in living in them.
Living there.
And as long as the money was coming in, they took it. But when it became trouble, they just sort of dropped them. And we went on and we fixed up about 300 or 400 apartments.
Ambassador,
But
how long were you all based in Chicago?
almost a year. Well, in fact, I was there in and out for 66 and 67. And one of the problems with Chicago was that we had too many things going on. We had something going on with the schools, trying to improve the, well, they were paying about $200 a year for every black child's education, but a white child out in Evanston probably got $800 or $900 a year spent on his education. So there were issues like that, getting fair equity in the cost of education. We started marching into neighborhoods that would not allow blacks to live. That got pretty violent. In fact, it was more violent in Chicago than it was in the South, because in the South, you'd have 100, very seldom more than 200 Klansmen. But in Chicago, we ended up with thousands of people chanting and throwing bricks and bottles at us, and because they didn't want any black folk even marching in their community.
That surprised you. The reception in Chicago, the reception in Chicago genuinely surprised you and Dr. King and others.
No, it didn't. I mean, I have always felt that, for instance, where I grew up in New Orleans, the neighborhood was integrated. That was all poor folk, but it wasn't racially divided so strictly. In Chicago, you had a neighborhood where you might have Italian families, and then that was different from the neighborhood where you had Irish families, and different from the neighborhood where you had Jewish families. Chicago was a partitioned city, and people lived only where their own nationality or culture was present. It probably is still that way. Mm-hmm. But we did quite a bit with jobs. We had a job training program that C.T. Vivian ran, and Bernard Lafayette was running the open housing part. Jesse was running the Operation Breadbasket, which was trying to get jobs. Well, it was integrating the economy of Chicago. You had people who were making well, for instance, Joe Louis Milk. I can't forget, because Joe Louis Milk, using Joe Louis' name as a brand, was a black-owned dairy company, and they couldn't get their milk on the shelves in black communities even. And so we took a comprehensive view to the problems of the North, and almost everything we worked on, we had success. Now, what happened in the middle of that, though, was that James Meredith decided to march in Mississippi, and he got shot. And we then ended up dividing our staff, which wasn't very big. We probably didn't have more than 30 staff people. So we had to send 5 or 6 people down south to continue the Meredith March in Mississippi. Then in Chicago, the war in Vietnam began to heat up, and young white militants began to come to Dr. King wanting him to help them with the war in Vietnam. Well, needless to say, we were stretched too thin. We managed to do just about everything, but not well. Normally, we counted as a victory a response from Washington with specific legislation to a problem. We got a response from Washington, from Lyndon Johnson, but it wasn't a legislative response. It was an administrative response. So we did get help from the manpower training program of the Department of Labor. We got help from Housing and Urban Development. There wasn't much we could do with desegregation of suburbs, though we did file some lawsuits. But I think overall, for the 30 or 40 staff people that Dr. King had, we were comfortable organizing in Birmingham, because Birmingham was just about 250,000 people, maybe 80,000 Black folk. Chicago was 2 million. We had more people in 1 or 2 neighborhoods in Chicago than we had in the whole city of Birmingham. And so, in addition to being overworked and overburdened, we got pulled into the war in Vietnam and back down south in Mississippi. But one thing was interesting. We decided to take some of the young people from the streets and bring them on as our staff. The Blackstone Rangers, and I mean, there were 3 or 4 different gangs of young people, and we took them down to Mississippi with us. They were pretty tough in their own neighborhoods, but when we got them down in Mississippi and they were not in their own neighborhoods, all of the gang differences sort of melted away, and they realized that they had to stick together and work together.
We are one. Yep.
And I'd say the end result was that we learned that we could use the tactics that we used in the South and new tactics in the North very successfully. The problem was that we didn't have a big enough staff, and we didn't have any money. Dr. King really, in terms of SCLC's budget, he never had more than $600,000 a year to operate on any year. Any year we were active in the South. And so to keep that going and then go to Chicago was really stretching us very, very thin. But we felt good about the response we got from the people. We felt good about the way the churches rallied around us. Because there was more Black business in Chicago, we got very good support from the Black business community. And we declared Chicago a success in the sense that we proved that nonviolent tactics that we were using in the South would work in the North. But before we could really do anything, of national significance in Chicago. We got pulled into the war in Vietnam, and that divided us up all over the country.
Let me ask you this, Ambassador. What was Dr. King and yours mindset as you left Chicago? And if you had to give yourselves a grade on your efforts there, what would that grade be?
Well, our efforts were A+, but our successes, simply because there were still instances of police brutality. There was a riot in Chicago on the west side. We were able to kind of slow it down and contain it, but we were not riot police. I think that the rioting, which had to be stopped by the National Guard, really put a damper on our work. But that brought us back to the economic issues of the Poor People's Campaign. And we decided you couldn't take on one city at a time, as we had in the South, that there were things that we learned in Chicago that we turned into national legislation. That we began to work on the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP and Urban League were not active with us. Well, I shouldn't say that. They were active with us in Chicago. We followed up in Washington.
Is it fair to say, Ambassador, that one of the legislative remedies that you were looking for from the Johnson administration when you were in Chicago in '66 was the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was passed just after Dr. King's assassination?
Well, that, and there was a Manpower Training Act. There were a number of things that President Johnson put into legislation in and around Dr. King's assassination. The whole poverty program and was related to our movement to end slums. There were a number of Manpower Training Acts that brought people. See, people forget that people who were in the North in the 60s had basically come up from the South in the 50s and early 60s, seeking work. And the federal government passed farm subsidies that stopped farmers from, they didn't need sharecroppers. And so you had a number of sharecroppers who couldn't grow food or fiber because the landlords were paid not to grow food. You found them coming north looking for jobs, totally unprepared. And that was one of the things we were trying to do, was find a way to help people in this transition from South to North.
Mm-hmm. Almost, Ambassador, 54 years after his assassination, what would Dr. King say about the state of affordable housing in America today?
Well, that's one thing we've not done very well with. We have had, by the time shortly after Dr. King's death, I became mayor of Atlanta. And we did a lot of things that were very creative. For instance, we took buildings, homes that were abandoned and not being lived in. And we passed an Urban Housing Act, which allowed us to sell these homes to individuals for $1. And if they bought it, they had to pick it out of a fishbowl. And they could pick up the number of a house. They could go to see it. And they had 10 days to decide whether they wanted to purchase it for $1. If they purchased it for $1, they also got $5,000 worth of credit to make it livable. And once they made it livable, we had it set up that they could get a mortgage and own the home. And these houses were selling for close to $100,000 by the time people lived in them and fixed them up a little bit. The problem with that was that was good for those who wanted to stay, but many people had come into the city from rural areas, and if they could get $100,000 for a house in Atlanta, they could go back to rural areas and they could build a much nicer house for $100,000. But so we found that a lot of our housing development ended up in what we called what's it called? Gentrification. Okay. Because they fixed them up. They were worth about $100,000, but young white couples would come in and buy them for $200,000, and they sold them. So that a number of those neighborhoods that were all Black here in Atlanta are now all white. But it took about 20 years. At the same time, the neighborhood I lived in was all white. And people were moving. The home I bought in 1966, the couple and their children had lived there for about 20 years, but their mother-in-law died and the children moved away, and there was only 2 people living in a 4-bedroom house with a finished basement. And I was able to buy it for $32,500. And I'm still living there.
So you would agree, Ambassador, that generational wealth is not necessarily bad, always bad in Black neighborhoods?
No, generational wealth is absolutely necessary and essential if possible. The problem is that that's the first possibility of generational
wealth.
Generational wealth is probably to own a home. If you can own a home and pass it on to your children. Hello?
I'm listening. I can hear you.
Yeah. If you can own a home and pass it on to your children, you've really done something.
Was that, Ambassador, your God bless you, you are less than 2 months shy of your 90th birthday? Was that your definition of generational wealth when you bought your first home?
No, I didn't know what generational wealth was. My parents had always said that they felt it was their responsibility to help me get an education, and if they could afford it, to give me the down payment on my first home. And they were able to do that. They gave me my undergraduate education. I paid for my own graduate education. But when I needed to buy a home,
And where was your first home, Ambassador? And what city?
the first home I bought was in New York. I was working for the National Council of Churches, and I think I borrowed $3,000. Well, I shouldn't say I borrowed it because I never paid it back. But my mother and father gave me $3,000 down payment on my first home. And I have done that with 3 of my 4 children. I got them through school with no debt. And several of them worked, well, they all worked some through school, and had some scholarship money, but they all came out of school with no debt, and we gave them usually it was about $3,000 would be enough of a down payment on a home in the neighborhoods where they bought. I don't remember exactly what each one was, but there were, well, my 3 daughters each needed a down payment on their first home, which we provided. They're on their own after that. My baby daughter took the house that I was living in Washington when I was in the Congress. And they have done very well living there in Southwest Washington.
I liked your analogy earlier, Ambassador, when you were talking about white Chicago slumlords. And you said that being a slumlord for them was a form of generational wealth.
Yeah. But it was usually generational wealth that they didn't really need. See, and they took the money that was mailed to them by a rental agency, but they didn't provide heat. They didn't fix up the apartments. They took the money out of and that's what created slums, taking money out of a community and not reinvesting in a community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Ambassador, just a few more questions. When did you first hear about Martin Luther King Jr. and how did you come to work for him?
I was pastoring in a little church in Marion. That was my first church in Marion, Alabama, which is about 50 miles from Montgomery, 50, 60 miles from Montgomery. And when I was there, I heard about the Montgomery bus boycott. I didn't meet Dr. King until a couple of years later when we both belonged to the same fraternity. And the Alphas at Talladega invited him for Religious Emphasis Week. Well, he was already on the cover of Time magazine and had run the Montgomery bus boycott. And I always felt that they invited him, and just in case he wasn't going to be able to make it, they invited me as a backup. Well, both of us showed up. And when we met, he realized, and I realized, and I don't think we discussed it, but his wife and my wife went to the same high school there in Marion, Alabama. And they had similar hard times growing up Coretta's house was burned down when she was 15. And the interesting thing to me was that her father's response was a very nonviolent response. He had them pray and thank God that they were not there. And then he asked for forgiveness for the sick people who burned their house down. And then he had them pray that they not hold any hatred or bitterness, because hate, as he said, is too great a burden to bear. But his message in 1946 or so was just about the same as the message of the pastor at Mother Emanuel in 2018 or so, at the AME church where the 8 people were shot.
In Charleston, yes, sir.
Yeah. But so it says to me that there is a nonviolent tradition in the Black community, and that no matter what happens to us, we don't hate anybody, and we work to overcome it. But that, well, Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, used to say all the time, over and over again, I don't, hate is too great a burden to bear. I won't, no man can make me hate him. And he said, they shot my father, they killed my son, they shot my wife while she was playing at the Lord's Prayer on the organ in church. My son died mysteriously, drowning in his swimming pool in his backyard. And he would recite the hard times he'd been. He said, but I don't care. I will not ever lower myself to hate any man.
Great, great. Well, Ambassador, I thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you.